So once again, everybody, I'm trying to get myself organized here. I just don't, my ADHD doesn't allow me to understand a lot of this. So we're getting there, hopefully. Okay, I think I'm here now. So everybody, welcome to Earthwalk Ways. I have a special show for you today. You were made from the same forces that created the universe. And you are an expression of the powers of the cosmos. So before we get into this beautiful teaching of a man by the name of Brian Swimme, I want to just invite you guys to, like this channel. If you want to listen for a little while to see what we're all about, that's great. And then also, if you want to learn more, you can go to my website, Earthwalk Ways, and learn more about the retreats and programs that I offer under this banner. So, Brian Swimme, who created this information, this presentation, I'm using a summary of his vast works, which you can find the story of the universe that he did, and he co-authored that. My mind is blanking now, with Thomas Berry. And then there's also another book that I just love that I've shared some on this channel, I believe, called The Universe is a Green Dragon. And so he also has this amazing presentation on the powers of the cosmos. I first ran across it in an audio kind of CD. So this is a basic summary of this very profound information that you don't see in a lot of other places. I find that it kind of pulls things together in a beautiful way for us. So it was in the 90s that he, did this groundbreaking work and saw this integration of some of the most recent science of, physics and astrophysics, and he's a mathematical cosmologist, as I said. So, he's looking at the universe definitely through the scientific lens, but he's realizing that if you look at it across the arc of time, that essentially there's what he calls the story of the universe that begins to emerge. And that perspective adds a lot of really cool things. So we're also, many years out from the 90s when this was first offered. And so a lot of the scientific facts that it was founded on were, can be questioned, or like there's new things coming in from, the telescopes now saying that maybe, the universe is much older, and all kinds of anomalies that we're discovering with our new James Webb telescope that kind of affects this particular way that he has laid the story out, but it doesn't affect the fundamental, relationships and the kind of overarching ways of this larger understanding of things. So that's what I want to present, and try not, if you know of different ways of looking at things, I'm trying not to get into a lot of the scientific facts, but just look at the principles, look at these powers. There's this old term, powers and principalities, that used to refer to the angelic beings, right? And in a way, that's what he's also, again, sort of hearkening back to, right, is that these are, beings at some level, right? And that the whole universe is a being. And so anyway, let's get into exploring some of the specifics of what he's talking about. Like one example might be, like these foundational aspects, for instance, like, gravity. We still don't know exactly what it is, etc., but if we can understand it as the power of attraction, right? Its fundamental action is the power of attraction. And so there's this way that that power, right, exists in gravity, but it exists all throughout the universe in all kinds of fascinating ways and forms. So that's kind of what lights me up, and it's kind of fun to just explore these things. And it's also fun to see them inside of ourselves, right? And see how those powers are alive within the human creativity that is this further creativity of the fundamental creativity of the universe. So anyway, I'm going to stop sharing. I think you don't need to see all my notes. Didn't realize I was still doing that. So there's this big idea, right? That Brian Swimme proposes, that the universe is not just a collection of inert matter, but a dynamic, self-organizing process. And we are not just in the cosmos, we are the cosmos experiencing itself. So today's focus, we're going to explore these 12 powers of the cosmos, these universal forces that drive existence from the Big Bang to the present moment, and how they can be recognized as operative in our lives. So let's set the stage. This is kind of an overview of the overarching story of the universe in its broadest swaths. So Swimme's work is deeply rooted in a scientific cosmological narrative. And this concept of cosmological narrative is really an interesting way of looking at, and organizing our understanding that we've gained in all of the scientific facts, the disparate facts. And, so it's like it pulls it together, I think. And so it also, speaks of the universe's emergence, development, and in this sense, diverging from a strict scientific interpretation, talks about purpose as well as ultimate fate. And so it provides a comprehensive framework for understanding reality, encompassing our observable experience, philosophical insight, scientific data, and then also spiritual or mythical dimensions. And, it's like that's the overarching cosmology, right? Has all of those aspects, like, most cosmologies we think of in terms of spiritual cosmologies or mythical cosmologies and that sort of thing. So the idea of a scientific cosmology is something relatively, it's kind of like it's there in pieces, but it's kind of like this overarching narrative that he attempted and did a beautiful job of. If you get a chance to watch, he has a master's degree course that was put on tape, on CD, called The Canticle to the Cosmos, which I also love, the song of the universe, the song of the cosmos. And so, that's a similar way of talking about a story. There's this, adding this dimension of the music of the spheres, I think. And anyway, it's a very beautiful way of seeing him as a young man on fire with these ideas and teaching a class, and it's pretty well done. And I think, again, while some of the facts may be not the same as they were back then, like new developments and understanding, it's still worth exploring. So I digress. Let me connect into this understanding then of this overall journey that we're on. So it situates humanity and all of Earth life within the context of, and at that time it was pretty well thought that it was like a 13 billion year stretch of cosmic evolution. We're not so sure anymore. It's very interesting how, everything keeps, expanding our understanding and our vision, and everything that we see changes what we thought we knew. So, but it's some long time of evolution, and that's the key, is that it's been a development. It hasn't, it's like emerged, and then it's gone from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, in large things. So, like there was the initial cosmic flare, and whenever that happened, we're, I think, still assuming, there are, I think, some theories that say that didn't happen at all, but at some level there's this kind of fundamental idea of a singularity that happens. And then, at that time, the initial, movement of that was so dense and vast and hot and everything, there were no laws of physics, there were no particles, there were no nothing, it was just this plasma of heat and, I guess, tiny, tiny particles of the subatomic realm. And so, there's this, initial birthing forth, though, and it is a kind of emergence. And that becomes like the prototype of this principle. One of the powers of the cosmos is emergence. The first power of the cosmos is emergence, right? And what we've discovered is that does hold, true across, all kinds of levels of fields, biological, creative insight, like new is emerging. Now, whether it's ultimately new, I mean, some philosophers say that, there's nothing new under the sun, and there's another realm, of reality where everything is first created, and that it pre-exists there. But there's just this beautiful, understanding of this concept of, an upwelling and an emergence that is, in another work of his, he talks about commissioned, essentially, the factors that have to come together to allow this newness to emerge are also multifaceted and, involve timing, is that a divine timing? I think in some ways, I don't see how we can avoid that assumption for, that to happen, because I was reading somewhere recently where, the sort of old style of Darwinian evolution is deeply being challenged now, in this way that it would just take way, way too many mutations that were unsuccessful with, take forever to evolve, in a useful way, through random selection, period. So, I think that was always my sense of it. How can that be? But, so there's something also driving, these pressures, that I think they're now talking about epigenetics and different things like that. But the main point, is that we're sort of embracing this cosmological narrative. We move beyond fragmented accounts of reality, and we begin to see the intrinsic connections, the connections between the formations of the stars, the cycling of the elements, the emergence of life, and the development of human consciousness. And it provides a shared origin story, which I like as well, for all peoples and including all species, fostering a sense of profound kinship and and responsibility for the whole. And it imbues existence with a purpose by showing the universe as a continuous creative process, a journey of emergence and self-organization in which every moment and every entity plays an essential contributing role. And understanding this context, I think, is essential, like to help us dive into these powers of the universe. And if you can kind of just sense this worldview that emerges then also out of, the story that we're mapping and pulling together and creating, that really does create a beautiful and amazing new context for humanity. And it's not based on ethnicity or religion, or, like maybe it can be a unifying enough understanding, based on some of these fundamental principles that we might all recognize. So who knows? But, it's like we all need some kind of cosmology. That's part of our difficulty, is that, in our culture, the old cosmologies have been sort of debunked, or the scientific cosmology is now being debunked, it's like, or just science in general, like people's distrust of all of these things is high. And so we have, just factions and different beliefs, and, so this could be some kind of maybe underlying unifying. It doesn't we're not trying to wipe out diversity, but we need a platform. So, if maybe there can be sort of this larger context and sort of more open-ended, understanding of the way that the universe works, and seeing it reflected within our own journeys and our own lives and in our collective experiences. Okay, so let's again look at, so there's this original quantum fluctuation, and this epoch marks the initial moment and the spontaneous, incomprehensible beginning, where all time and space and energy burst forth from an infinitesimal point. In this moment of intense heat and density, the fundamental laws of physics were established, setting the stage for everything that would follow. And so this is the ultimate expression of the powers and principles of, like we said before, emergence, but also of radiance. And so we're going to break these principles down later on and kind of give them a deeper definition and understanding. But you can kind of sort of begin to sense into, like as the universe birthed forth, it was this emergence and radiance. And then there's the stellar formation, which sort of is the cosmic furnace. So that's kind of what happens next is following the initial expansion, matter starts coalescing under, in this theory, the power of allurement, which in its physical form is expressed through gravity. So we sort of have a theory that maybe it wasn't, an equal dispersion of all matter, and so where there were clumps of matter, there was higher density, and in the density, higher gravity, and that then began to allure, bring together, coalesce, and collect more of the substances. So the power of allurement basically forms these vast clouds of hydrogen and helium. And as these clouds collapsed, the first stars ignited. And these stars are the universe's catalytic power. Nuclear fusion reactions within their cores created every element heavier than hydrogen and helium. Every element from carbon to iron. And when these massive stars died in supernovas, they scattered these elements across the cosmos, fulfilling the profound truth that we are literally stardust. So everything that is of matter, and solid form in some sense, right, came from the explosion of these stars, to create these elements that then, again, through this power of allurement, and this catalytic power that originally created them, and then they came together, to create Earth, to create ourselves as well. So I like that understanding, that we are stardust. So because this is a scientific description, like I said, it kind of leaves out the dimension of consciousness, especially at the beginning. He does bring it in a little later. But I just wanted to expand even on it there and just talk about how many other cosmologies have really understood, and when they look at the stars, they see, and even the powers themselves as beings, as angels, as I was saying before, as animals or personified forces of nature in some way, the gods, right? So I think it's interesting that our deep instincts are to personify these forces. And I think that instinct is not just, immature in some way, or, I'm not even sure that even the primitive peoples, like totally identified, with these personifications. I think it's a way of relating, right? That when we can personify, something that's something beyond our understanding in a way, then that gives us some way of relating to it. And it's, not completely inaccurate, right? So like when we talk about a power of allurement, we can relate to that, and we can also see it operative in the world and in the universe. So it's interesting to just play with this, and I invite everyone to do that. It reanimates the world in a way that I think we lost in childhood. And I think that, that loss is maybe not so necessary, that there's a way that we can integrate, this thing where we're not in, I guess, superstitious, beliefs, but we can hold a kind of open-ended possibility and look for within natural expressions, the intelligence, the consciousness, the communication with the human that I find, like when we're in deeper connection, seems to be much more apparent than it is to the sort of separated Western consciousness. So let's continue with these different, so after the stars were formed, then the planets. So out of the scattered remnants of deceased stars, new solar systems and planets began to form. So our solar system actually came together after a much larger star that was in our region, supernova, right? And all of these materials were in this region, and then another allurement created the collective gathering of the materials in our current sun, and then also of the planetary bodies and the planetary plane and everything. It's very interesting and elegant in so many ways. And of course, astrology, like watches these dances and looks at history. I like, maybe there's personality astrology or, personal readings, but there, I think, is a larger, interesting thing about how astrology seems to also reflect the collective movement of nations and of times. And especially when we're in times like these, it's at least a useful use of time, I think, to just explore, what does this system say about this? And of course, you want to have your own inner authority. It's good to have a little bit of an open mind, and I notice that there are some things that I close the door on right away. And that's, I think, okay. We may not be able to entertain that for one reason or another, and maybe because it's, it's simply not a truth that we could ever adhere to, so it seems like it's more interesting to follow the possibilities. And so there's this way that, this process of the solar system and the planets forming was a process of kind of a monumental display of the principle of self-organization, so one of the powers of the cosmos, and the power of bonding. So as diverse elements combined and arranged themselves into complex, gravitationally stable systems, Earth formed in this crucible of cosmic debris and became a perfect environment to express the power of the cosmic principle of nurturing. I love that one, right? That the Earth is this expression and has, evolved into, with all of these powers that came before, now her unique expression activates, and maybe there's other places in the universe this activation happens, but this power of nurturing comes into expression. And that fosters the next great epoch. And so then we have the era of the biological era, the life and consciousness. So on Earth, the elements forged in stars and gathered into a planet began an unprecedented transformation. Through processes driven by emergence and bonding, non-life transitioned into living cells, giving rise to all biological diversity. This era is defined by the growing presence of another principle called interiority. This power of interiority, points to our inner life, subjectivity that we know exists from the simplest bacterium to the profound self-awareness of human consciousness. And this is one of the powers, this power of interiority, of subjectivity, that, humans tend not to grant other life forms, and in that way they can disregard, the impacts that they might have on something that is sensitive, aware in some way. And, maybe, if it's a deadly bacterium, that's okay. I don't know. But there's kind of like a way that, again, we want to just invite a wider examination of our own more narrow humanistic lens that we look through, and cultural lens that, we've inherited, that, like looks at the rest of the universe, separately in various ways. And what we don't see mostly outside of ourselves is this power of interiority. And that's saying a lot if you really explore that. So this planetary formation and this creation of complex systems like Earth then allowed this biological emergence of life and consciousness, and this deeper development of the space of interiority. So this kind of leads us to another principle that I think is foundationally, unique and different in this story of the universe. And that is where the universe actually is the subject of the story, right? It is beyond the purely materialistic view of a history of the, material unfolding. He emphasizes that this universe does not seem to be a random accident. In fact, more like a dynamic and creative entity. And we know, like even with the Gaia hypothesis, we begin to, see that there were these, mechanisms that were, created in place to maintain certain stability, this kind of thing. So there is some kind of dynamism in effect here for sure. And it is both maintaining itself and developing itself, right? And I don't know what else we could, what else we need to think of something as a subject with inherent tendencies and intentions. So this view suggests that, the entire however many billion-year cosmic journey is really a purposeful unfolding. And it's driven by these very powers that we're exploring, and that, recognizing the universe as a subject will fundamentally shift our relationship with it, transforming us from detached observers, which is kind of the legacy of the scientific process, which, is giving birth to this beautiful thing. So, it's a beautiful seeking in its own right, and it's very young. And so as it's maturing more and more now, it's revealing to us a lot of the powers and the secrets hidden within the cosmos. And so, there is this purposeful unfolding that appears, to be happening. And so when we recognize the universe as subject, it fundamentally shifts our relationship with it. And that, I'm repeating this, transforms us from detached observers into conscious participants in the ongoing creativity. So, I don't know if that resonates, but it feels to me like this beautiful, Earth cosmos invitation. It feels like, we're all welcome here. We all can contribute here. Our unique individual creativity is actually also woven back into the fabric of the cosmos in various ways that we can't even imagine. So let's now go into the 12 powers of the cosmos. And I'm going to try to share the screen again just so we can look at these charts a little bit. Give me one more minute here. Let's see. Okay, so I guess it's a little small. Let me see if I can make it bigger somehow. No, well, maybe that did help a little. I don't know if it's going to get big enough. I guess I could just simply share this. So let me do that. I think you can read it better. Okay. So I'm gonna scroll up because we apparently scrolled down. Yep. So we're talking now about the powers of the cosmos, and these are these universal dynamics we've sort of been alluding to and mentioning in the previous. So first of all is this power of allurement, and it's described as the force of attraction and desire that pulls things towards complex unification. Right, so see if you can, I like to see if I can think of things, that relate in my life, right? How can I, allure, use this power of attraction, to, I was called to, say, my retreat, my Earthwalk retreat, it allured me here, and then I'm hoping that I can, that power of attraction will also pull things towards me in a way to beautifully complexify and unify and create something very new. And so that's my example. He gives an example here in the chart. Gravity pulling matter into stars and planets. So this is the drive also of organisms to mate, right? And we probably have experienced that form of allurement, right? So emergence is this amazing capacity to generate novelty. It's the more than the sum of its parts effect. And we are seeing a lot of that kind of emerge from AI. Right now we're in this huge time of emergence in our world, and it's part of what I think is causing some destabilization. And then there's the shifts from atoms to molecules. These are his examples, right? So this emergence, you're seeing in the shift from atoms to molecules, or non-life to living cells, right? And there's a way that I think that the woven, interactions of things, bring forth. There's a new science kind of holons and holarchies rather than hierarchies, right? Everything is a part within a whole, and each part is conscious and it's doing its own thing, but in that it's also multiple parts within a larger whole. And so we see, all of the, like, atoms to molecules to, cells to organ structure, it's like this is this power of, more than the sum of its parts, and this way to allure and bring forth, brand new things. So self-organization is the inherent tendency of systems to arrange themselves into complex ordered forms, and they don't need external control. I think I was listening to scientists recently talking about how, we really don't know, where the original heartbeat of a fetus comes. It's like there's no nervous impulse to tell it to start, right? So there's these ways in which maybe that could be more of an example of emergence, but, that there's just this lack of external control. Things happen, and then they move into self-organization. So they move into an attempt at stabilization, what we're talking about. So one example of this is convection cells in liquids, So I'm not sure I understand fully how to explain that, but I know that that there's, as you heat a liquid, that you see the bubbles rising, but then you also see it start to spin and twirl, and so it's creating currents, and these are like self-organized structures. In a way, they retain their shape. Also, the flame of a fire, or here he's saying the formation of snowflakes. So these are all examples, crystallization of things, also is like an example in the snowflakes. And these are all forms of self-organizing. You see it in a creek, at a certain level, the water has a certain, more or less, stable pattern. It does, flex. And, you can hear that in the sound along the stream. So, beyond self-organization, there's also this property, this power that's part of these fundamental powers of the cosmos. These are the powers of emergence and creation, these first four. So radiance is the power of a thing to communicate its existence and essence outwards. So we radiate, ourselves out into the world. He gives the example that the light from the sun is this radiance. The song from a bird is this radiance. I know in some work I do with forest bathing, when we think about looking at a tree, we often think of the old scientific understanding that we had, that, the light from the sun, like hits the tree, bounces off the tree into our eye, and we have this experience of the tree through a visual medium. But I think fundamentally he's sharing in this that it's not totally accurate, right? That the photon actually penetrates into the tree and excites, the molecular structure of the tree, the atoms, that, and the ways that they're bonded and stuff. And so, in that excitation, in that added energy, the tree itself is then emitting its own light, right? It radiates. It needs the help of the sun. All life needs the help of the sun to do almost everything. But, in this way, we can see it as an active radiance that we even see the tree. The tree is showing itself to us, right? Hey, I'm here, everybody. Look at me, right? And it's so beautiful to, acknowledge and greet that tree, or, send, appreciation, or attention back in some way. And we do that sort of spontaneously and naturally, it's like we're sort of made to grok, right? And we see something beautiful, we see something alive, curious, interesting, and we just, fascinate onto it. And we need to have a lot more of that in this beautiful, free, open, sensitive way, not like an addictive way or a manipulative way, but just a beautiful, curious way. So now we're moving into the powers of relationship and transformation. So bonding. Bonding is the power. And this is a fundamental power of the cosmos. And it is a power that is the capacity for fusion and deep connection, creating enduring systems. So the strong nuclear force holding the nucleus together is an example of this power of bonding. But then we also see the same power of bonding at a completely different scale of relationship in friendships and community building. Then there's this universal power of the catalytic power, right? And this is the ability to trigger rapid and profound change in a system while remaining unchanged itself. So that's an interesting power. He gives the example of an enzyme facilitating a biological reaction, so it activates something, but I guess the enzyme is not fundamentally changed, or like an idea that changes society. And before, he talked about the sun as the catalytic power, for the earth. And so, without the sun's light, nothing would be happening here on earth. And so all of the changes on earth and all of the earth is, dependent in a way on that relationship with the sun. And again, relationship, right? It's a bond. It's a dance of love and marriage. It's a fascination and a curiosity. It's like you could, maybe anthropomorphize a little bit without, being too sinful, and imagine, that the sun is, circling, or that the earth is circling the sun, like bonded with fascination and the potential of what might be created in that cycle of, dance around the sun over the millennium. And, enters into this exchange, into this relationship in this way that, has created all of the amazing life and creatures and landscapes and, cultures and everything here, right? So I love this stuff because it really helps reignite this sense of wonder within us that we, I think somehow lost it from our sort of egoic need to think we understand everything. So there's a lot we don't. And then here we are, looking at it from this lens and, again, not understanding everything, but, I think this lens helps us see it in a different light. And I think a lot of knowledge and wisdom is more like that, not new facts, not new information, but new perspective. So another power of relationship and transformation is the power of homecoming. And this is the drive to return to a source of belonging and security, or maybe a deep resting state, would be its more physical expression. So, water flowing back to the ocean, the human need for security and intimacy. So, like, we can see this probably in many, many ways and forms, and feel it in our own deepest being. So then there's the power of mutation, which is the necessary power of rupture, which is part of, I think, what's going on now that, it's always challenging and difficult, right? Because especially our biological organism and our ego and our conscious brain, it likes consistency. and we want to predict, and we want to feel like we know, and we're, safe in that, so this is a big shaking, a big mutation that's happening now that I think is, again, creating chaos, but it leads to new possibilities, it's shaking everything up so that new possibilities can manifest, can be recognized, can, happen just even naturally, who knows what will come out of this current shaking process that we're in. So genetic mutation is one example he gives, creating new species. And then, another example would be the collapse of an old star, right? And so we go through stages, and everything has death. And so death, it looks like he's including in this power of mutation. And so, of course, death is also every ending we've ever faced of anything that we've ever had any attachment to, right? And so, again, there's a big study, I think, that we have as humans to how to meet this change and how to learn to, relax into it, to process the grief, because I don't think we can just jump over it. But I think we can find ways of doing it more easily, healthily, and with less, like we're terrified of it, right? And so we have a huge resistance, and that adds to the holding on and then the difficulty of releasing it. Okay, so part C, powers of preservation and future. So there's the power of nurturing, and that is the capacity to sustain and foster the growth and development of other beings. And so, like in all ways, most of us have experienced this capacity and feel the call, feel the pleasure, feel the longing, to do such a thing. Not everybody, but a lot of us. So, just honor this capacity that's, like in some ways, in our experience, emerged with the planet, right? We're here coming up on Earth Day, right? And so this nurturing capacity was at least most beautifully represented by this, fundamental aspects of this planet. And, like somehow within, the whole biofield system, right? It continued to maintain, this capacity to sustain and foster itself, its own growth. And within that, to do that was done through the development of such diversity, so many other beings, right? And to celebrate diversity and to celebrate nurturing is something that this world is struggling with right now. It seems somehow, I guess, more necessary or needed at this time to be tough and strong. The Mars energy, which I have a lot of myself, is like really active in our current thing. But I think it's also, coming into rebalance. It's also in a place of mutation, transformation, which is down here coming up. So maybe it'll fit there. But there's this, alternate pull that has been, I think, not so valued for some time in our culture, the value of the feminine, right, of the relational, of the sustaining and fostering. I remember reading about, Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, which was kind of like this, frustrating tome about how all of the work that women do, and for her it was not transcendent work, it was just repetitive, it was, boring, dull. I guess we're getting rid of all of that with AI now. But there's this feeling of sort of the imminent, endless, keeping chaos at bay kind of work that is most often, done by women, and how this, like limits women and feels like a weight, in their creativity and that sort of thing. So I think that there is this truth in this, but I think it misses the real call of this kind of work, right? What is this work for? Hopefully not just for the man. Hopefully, what we're doing in that drudgery, if it feels like drudgery, or in that, day-to-day chop wood, carry water, right, is that we are really fostering this capacity for growth, to sustain each other, the growth and the development of ourselves and other beings. We're somehow contributing. And I think if we may still want to, do more transcendent work and less eminent work, but in some ways, if we could also honor more deeply, more fully, this nurturing capacity and this need for each other to sustain and foster the growth and development of each other. And I think, even in the corporate climate where, we're having all of these chat boxes be the support systems, that try to guide us through some very complex things that don't ever seem to work, it's like that's not very nurturing. And it doesn't feel that to us. And so there's this journey that we're taking. So transformation, the complete alteration of form and function. This is death leading to rebirth. This is a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. This is starlight transforming into life energy. So this one, yeah, you know, it's like it's very close to us in so many ways. And I believe that it's also, you know, speaking to our moment, because I have a sense that humanity as it is, you know, is like a caterpillar right now, kind of ending its time of being a caterpillar, right? You know, it's ready to become a butterfly. And so this kind of change that we're facing, you know, is not just a mutation, it is like a complete transformation. Metamorphosis. So, like, see if you can relax into the not knowing, because there's no way that the caterpillar has any idea. Probably, maybe it does, maybe there's a different understanding, but, you know, from my perspective, you know, the caterpillar would not likely know what it's like to be a butterfly until it emerges as a butterfly. And then I don't know if it remembers being a caterpillar, right? They feel somewhat discontinuous, but then everything is connected. So maybe that's also a form of ignorance, right? Not clarity about deeper things that are going on. But yeah, transformation is such a profound thing. And this is where also, you know, every ending, every loss, everything, you know, whether it's our own death or deaths of people that we care about or need, or, you know, deaths of systems, or, you know, endings of certain, you know, chapters in our lives, right? These are all a kind of death. And what we're here to learn about that is this, you know, we resist it, we kick and we scream, you know, understandably, but there is this way that we need to realize that there is something bigger going on, right? It's not just that the old is dying. Something new is trying to be born. And most likely that new thing, you know, is an evolutionary development, is a expansion, is a, you know, wonderful thing that the universe is wanting to lead us into even greater capacity, greater light, greater love, greater creativity, and, you know, joy. So memory. So this is the one that I feel like the universe didn't give me a very good dose of. So this is the universe's capacity to accumulate and retain the achievements of the past. So, you know, it's like this is DNA carrying the history of life. It's the geological strata that preserves the Earth history, right? And there's, you know, it's like the foundation, the ground on which it's made. And, you know, I think, you know, the body naturally has its, you know, memory and function, and functions through a sort of natural universal memory, you know, that is in the DNA, right? And again, it's not just being passed, you know, through the generations, but it's actually, you know, operating through the, I guess, you know, informational RNA signaling that continues my, you know, life function. And so my body is remembering, and, you know, so there's a confusion, I think, in my own being around, you know, how to retain a certain, you know, like, I guess it's that frontal lobe executive sort of presence, because I just, you know, it's here now. And then if I get distracted or go on to the next thing, it's gone, and it may be gone. I may wake up in the middle of the night remembering it. But it's very funny how it works, and you know, sometimes creates difficulty because I'm dropping balls, or, you know, getting off track in some way. And you can even tell by the way that I share this, right? You know, we're all over the place, but that has some superpower as well. So I hope you can follow me, and I hope that you enjoy this. We're down to the final power of interiority, which I also love, and we spoke to a little earlier. So this is the inner life or subjectivity that is present in all forms of existence. And this interiority grows with complexity. So, like, you know, I mean, each one of us as individuals, like, you know, we think we know ourselves to some degree, but, you know, it's like in my journey, I've seen more and more how, like, we're we're the tip of the iceberg in terms of, like, really understanding the depth of our interiority. And so, like, a part of it has been that we're kind of afraid of going in there because it's in the interiority also that we experience pain, shame, you know, unpleasant difficulties and feelings, and most often, you know, activated within our own being, but it's like, you know, part of the reflection of sort of programming that we're carrying. And so there's this, you know, way that we're afraid of seeing the vastness and the beauty and the depth that's within us, partly because we don't recognize and don't understand that that's there. Sort of everything that we've been taught is there as something's wrong or something's bad or something, right? And then, you know, we try to deny it, we try to control it, we try to push it into the unconscious, you know. And so by the time you're my age, there's a lot of material stashed down there, and it you know, is a depth of interiority that is not always easy or pleasant to feel, and yet it's always extremely rich. And so if we can begin to understand, you know, that it's worth a little discomfort, and it's not what we think it's going to be, you know, it's like not what we fear, to go in and bring forth more awareness of all of this interiority. And of course, there's a lot of work, you know, the somatic work, you know, the inner relationship work. There's all kinds of, you know, internal dynamics, also all of our experiences within our psyche that, you know, are, you know, very complex. And it is in the self-knowledge of that complexity that we gain through our interiority that, you know, we can really begin to sort of clear and navigate and heal a lot of the, you know, confusion and misconception that we labor under in that. So let's drop down a little more. Whoops. Okay. So this is just an example here, you know, of exploring, you know, so we've been using some examples. So we can begin to consciously engage with these powers of the universe. And so we might want a deeper dive here later on, you know, to see how this works. But you can start with your imagination. And there's, oops, am I still sharing? Okay, let me stop the share. So, yeah, done with the chart. And so there's a way that, you know, we can learn to apply these forces. And so example, you know, engage the power of allurement by pursuing a goal you truly desire. And not only engage it, but explore it, you know, like what is your desire? Where is your desire? Do you have any desire? Where does the desire, you know, get squashed or squelched, or, you know, somehow not, you know, ability to kind of harness this as something that, you know, can help bring us towards something, right? Which is its purpose, is to bring us towards something. So if our allurement is not functioning all that well, and we're having difficulty, you know, then we need to explore, like, what's in the way of that, right? We can't make things happen, but we can look at where it's blocked and work to remove the things, more consciousness, more awareness can help our personalities understand and support, the resurfacing maybe, or the reactivation of the power of allurement inside of us if for some reason it's missing. So another example is we can embrace mutation when facing a difficult change. And so what does that look like? And, how can the power of mutation, support that? So if I, go back and look at that, the description again is the necessary power of rupture, change, and breakage. So, in the Pathwork, the guide also has a lecture that might relate here that is kind of like the nature or the spiritual meaning of crisis, right? And he's saying it's because the power of the life force, is moving in one direction. The creativity of the universe is moving in one direction, and it wants to move through us in some way, but there's some resistance that we're in, and so we're blocking it. And so the force of the life force is bigger than ours, and eventually it's probably going to upset us, up in things, create a crisis if we don't recognize a need for expansion, a need for, some kind of shifting or movement is being asked of us, and that we're not able to respond to, we're not able to give. So then, things have to kind of go into crisis, be a kind of, again, bigger shaking, bigger earthquake in our lives that helps us open up, to now we have to be present and deal with this in a way, but it's kind of like it gives us a different, whole different input, it does work, and there's oftentimes when I felt that, crisis has come, that I felt more strong presence of guidance with me. It's like the everyday frustrations I can get lost in, but like when something big happens, like it's got my attention. Right? Whoa, the universe is guiding me. Something is trying to communicate. What are you saying? So, if we can approach crisis like that to some degree, and again, it varies, and sometimes crises are very challenging, right? So not to belittle that, but, to just really try to hold this space. And that's part of what he's saying, is if we can, understand that when we're going through these things, it's necessary, and it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing, and it's the universe, doing something, profound and powerful. But it's for our benefit. We don't have to feel paranoid. It really is trying to help move us forward in some way, just as the evolution of the universe is continuing. So this helps me, even in today's situation, right? To just look at, mutation and transformation as the forces that we're kind of in the midst of right now. And, to see those forces not necessarily as so threatening, which I can, and see them, as possibly happening, through us, for us, in some way that we can't fully understand. And maybe all of this polarization is also, coming out just for awareness, right? And compassion or other things. I know, I still, go into sort of a place of demand, a place of, expectation of something more from people. But I'm beginning to realize, like even in myself, like it's not usually a useful approach. I need to be with things as they are, and then try to bring forth out of me what's needed. And that can only happen when I can ground and settle in what is. So that's my biggest work at this time, is really, sort of allowing myself to breathe and not react immediately. I don't know if it's the PTSD or the ADHD or what, but or the first degree Aries. I mean, my impulse barometer is off the track, so it's like I have this, you know, continual feeling like, well, I don't even know how to hold back on the reins. And so we're still working, you know, trying to find, you know, a way to deepen, right? I don't think it's a matter of control. And it's a matter of, you know, just more awareness. So like, again, to me, this journey is just, you know, a beautiful life journey of inner exploration and growth. You know, we're like everything else in this universe, you know, exploring, experiencing our interiority, our subjectivity, our perspective, you know. And I don't think the universe says right, wrong, good, bad, okay, not okay. You know, I think that the Earth Mother is amazingly brilliant at allowing all of her creation to continue creating and making room for what is. And then maybe, yeah, need some boundaries here, or, you know, where there's opportunity of something expanding beyond its, you know, natural limits, maybe, you know, something else takes advantage of that, you know, and moves in. But there's a kind of balancing that is part of nature that, you know, we need to learn more, feel how that power comes through as a human being, and how we can, you know, both balance on inside of ourselves and offer balancing space in the world. Okay, well, I guess we're a little over our usual hour, but I hope that you enjoyed this, and, you know, please check out Brian Swimme's stuff. Again, go to the Earthwalk Ways website and, you know, explore some of the events, you know, get in touch with me. Feel free to contact me, earthwalkways@gmail.com. I'm still learning a little more about how to do chats and stuff like that, so hopefully we'll have more interaction as we go. I am a very slow adapter of all of this very complex and detailed technology, which is not sort of my main strength. Okay. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope that, you know, this helps you embrace your identity, you know, as cosmological beings, and that you can recognize the profound depth and creativity that's inherent within all of existence, and, you know, find a way to meet that in joy and love and creativity yourself. Okay. Thank you. See you next